Before I start, I want you to do one small thing for me. Tap the subscribe button and leave a comment. Have you ever experienced something in the wilderness that you couldn't explain? A moment that made you question everything you thought you knew about the natural world. Keep that in the back of your mind while you listen. Because by the time this story is over, you might start looking at your own strange experiences very differently. They teach you a lot in ranger training. How to approach a wounded bear, how to track a lost hiker, how to spot an ambush. What they never teach you is what to do when your satellite data stops making sense. I've been stationed at the gates of the Arctic monitoring outpost for 6 years now, and I honestly believed I had seen every strange pattern the wildlife tracking system could throw at me. Grizzlies denning in the wrong places, caribou herds shifting their migration routes, wolf packs appearing and vanishing across the tundra like ghosts. But what started happening last October, none of my training covered that. Not the federal guidelines, not the classified briefings, nothing. My name is Ambrose Fenn. I'm writing this because the official reports never tell the whole story. They can't. The clean, sterile documents sent to the National Park Service leave out the parts that would make people ask questions no one wants to answer. So I'm recording everything here exactly as it happened because something is moving through the northern wilderness that someone needs to know about. Something our satellites can track but can't identify. Something that doesn't match anything in our biological databases. Gates of the Arctic National Park lies north of the Arctic Circle, buried deep in the Brooks Range. It covers nearly 8 million acres of roadless wilderness. Most people imagine it as a place where nature still moves to its own ancient rhythm, untouched and empty. And for the most part, that's true. Maybe 10,000 visitors come each year, almost all of them during the short summer when the midnight sun makes travel possible. The rest of the year, it's just us, a handful of rangers and researchers keeping a network of remote monitoring stations alive across an area so large you could lose entire mountain ranges inside it. I'm stationed at 7th Outpost, right where the boreal forest gives way to open tundra, where the last thin spruce trees fade into nothing. From the outside, it doesn't look like much. A reinforced cabin, a few solar panels, a satellite dish, and enough insulation to keep you alive when temperatures drop to -40 in January. But the building isn't what makes 7th Outpost important. It's what's inside it. Especially the advanced wildlife monitoring system that processes data from over 400 satellite-linked sensors spread across our sector. That system is far more advanced than most people realize. Each sensor package includes thermal imaging, motion detection, acoustic monitoring, and something called biological signature analysis. It identifies species based on heat patterns, movement profiles, and electromagnetic fields produced by living organisms. Officially, it was installed as part of a federal climate change study on Arctic ecosystems. That's what we were told anyway. But I always suspected there was more to it. Interest from defense or intelligence agencies watching territory that's becoming more strategically valuable. As the Arctic opens up, you learn not to ask too many questions about the equipment you're given. You just use it. You file your reports. In theory, the system works simply. When something moves through the sensor grid, an alert is generated and sent to our station computers. The software automatically classifies the detection. Caribou, wolf, bear, fox based on size, heat, and movement patterns. Most of the time, it's astonishingly accurate. I can sit at my desk with a cup of coffee and watch a grizzly cross a valley in real time, or track a migrating caribou herd with a precision that would have seemed like science fiction 20 years ago. The data gets logged, analyzed, and turned into reports that help us understand population shifts, predator-prey relationships, and how climate change is reshaping animal behavior. October started out completely normal. I was running routine checks, logging the seasonal patterns we've seen for decades. Caribou were beginning their push south ahead of the harshest weather. Grizzlies were deep into hyperphagia, packing on as much weight as possible before hibernation. Wolf packs were spreading wider as they followed the herds. Everything fit the expected cycles. Nature was doing what it always does. The first anomaly appeared on October 8th. My partner, Harlan Cutler, and I were reviewing the overnight data. Harlan had been at 7th Outpost even longer than I had, nearly 13 years, and no one knew wildlife patterns better than him. He was the one who noticed it. A detection that should have been green was flagged yellow, meaning the system had recorded something but couldn't classify it with confidence. When we opened the details, that's when the wrongness set in. The alert came from a sensor about 40 mi northeast of our station near the Arach Peaks. The time stamp was 2:19 in the morning, not unusual. In October, with darkness returning, a lot of animals move at night. What was unusual was the signature itself. The thermal image showed something much larger than a wolf moving steadily across the tundra, but the heat profile was wrong. Too uniform, too smeared out. It didn't show the warm core and cooler limbs you'd expect from any mammal. That was the moment I knew something wasn't right. The biological signature analysis, which should have identified the species, just returned error codes. Not an unknown classification which might indicate a rare species or an animal in unusual circumstances, but actual system errors suggesting the data didn't fit any parameters the software was designed to process. The movement pattern was steady and purposeful, straight-line travel at approximately 4 mph, faster than most large predators walk, but slower than a running pace. It moved for 47 minutes, triggering sensors along a nearly precise north-south line, then simply vanished. One moment it was there, registering across multiple data streams. The next moment, nothing, as if it had ceased to exist. Harlan frowned at the screen, his weathered face creasing deeper than usual. He was in his late 50s with the kind of lean, hardened build that comes from decades of outdoor work in harsh conditions. His gray beard was neatly trimmed, and his eyes had that permanent squint of someone who'd spent too many years staring across bright snow and endless horizons. When he spoke, his voice carried the flat, careful tone of someone who'd learned to be cautious about jumping to conclusions. Could be a sensor malfunction, he said, though he didn't sound convinced. Multiple failures creating garbage data that the system can't interpret. We've had cascading errors before, especially when temperatures drop suddenly. Electronics don't like extreme cold. I nodded, wanting to believe that explanation. But something about it didn't sit right. The sensors were designed for Arctic conditions, rated to operate at temperatures far below what we'd been experiencing. And while cascading failures were possible, the odds of multiple sensors malfunctioning in perfect sequence to create a coherent movement path seemed unlikely. It was easier to believe the equipment was working fine and had simply detected something our classification algorithms weren't prepared for. Could be a grizzly with unusual thermal characteristics. I suggested maybe sick or injured, something affecting its heat signature, or debris on the sensor lenses creating false readings. Harron pulled up the weather data from that night. Clear skies, light winds, temperature around 15 degrees F nothing that would explain sensor errors or create the kind of atmospheric conditions that might distort thermal imaging. He cycled through the raw sensor feeds, examining each detection event individually, and I could see his expression gradually shifting from curious to concerned. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a thermal image frozen on the screen. The shape was vague, just a blob of warmth against the cold background. But there was something about its outline that seemed wrong. Not quite organic, too symmetrical in some ways, too irregular in others. It reminded me of those optical illusions where your brain tries to interpret an ambiguous shape and keeps flipping between multiple possibilities, never quite settling on one. We spent the next hour going through the data systematically, checking calibrations, running diagnostic tests, comparing the anomalous readings against known baselines. Everything checked out. The sensors were functioning normally. The data was clean and valid. We'd simply recorded something that didn't match anything in our database, and that should have been impossible. After 4 years of operation, the Oz had encountered and cataloged every species in our sector multiple times over. The classification system was robust, constantly updated, capable of distinguishing between similar species with high accuracy. For it to fail so completely meant we detected something genuinely novel. "We need to file this," I said finally, though I wasn't sure who we should file it with or what classification to use. Harlan agreed, and we spent another hour drafting a report that tried to describe what we'd seen without sounding like we were claiming Bigfoot was wandering through the Brooks Range. We sent it up the chain to the regional office in Fairbanks, flagging it as a priority technical issue requiring analysis by the system engineers. The response came back faster than expected just 2 hours later, not from our usual contacts in Fairbanks, but from someone named Virgil Petton with a federal email address I didn't recognize. The message was brief and formal, thanking us for the alert and informing us that technical specialists would investigate the sensor anomalies. In the meantime, we should continue normal operations and report any similar events immediately. The tone was professional, but carried an undercurrent of something else. Not quite urgency, but heightened attention that made me wonder if we'd stumbled into something that certain agencies were already monitoring. I tried to put it out of my mind and focus on routine work. But over the next 3 days, the anomalies continued. Never in the same location, always at night, always with the same pattern of unidentifiable thermal signatures moving in purposeful straight lines before vanishing. On October 8th, sensors in the Alatna Hills detected something for 32 minutes. On October 9th, something triggered sensors along the Noke River for over an hour. On October 10th, multiple detection events across widely separated locations, as if several of these unknowns were moving through our sector simultaneously. Each time I filed reports, each time Virgil Petton responded with the same brief acknowledgement, and each time my unease grew deeper because the patterns emerging from the data were disturbing in ways I couldn't quite articulate. These things, whatever they were, weren't random. They were systematic, methodical, conducting what looked increasingly like a coordinated survey of specific terrain features. And they were getting closer to Station 7. Harron felt it too. I could tell by the way he started double-checking the cabin security measures, making sure the reinforced doors were properly sealed, testing the emergency beacon that would summon evacuation if we ever needed it. Neither of us said it aloud, but we'd both spent enough time in the wilderness to recognize when something was hunting. When predator behavior shifted from opportunistic to purposeful, and whatever these signals represented, they were moving with predator purpose. The real turning point came on October 12th when I decided to do something that probably violated several protocols, but seemed necessary. I pulled up archived data from the past 2 years and ran a comprehensive search for similar anomalies, detection events that had generated classification errors or unusual signatures. The results made my blood run cold. They'd been happening for months. Small events, isolated incidents that individually looked like nothing more than minor technical glitches. A sensor error here, an unidentified reading there, all easily dismissed as the kind of routine problems you'd expect from sophisticated equipment operating in harsh conditions. But when I compiled them all together and mapped their locations over time, a pattern emerged that was undeniable. The anomalies had started in the far northern reaches of the park near the coast back in March. Over the following months, they'd gradually spread south and west, increasing in frequency and duration, moving through the territory in waves that suggested systematic exploration. And they'd been converging, multiple separate clusters of activity gradually drawing closer together, as if different groups were conducting surveys that would eventually merge into a comprehensive coverage of the entire sector. The convergence point where all these movement paths would eventually intersect was right here. Station 7 and the surrounding valley. I showed the analysis to Harren, and for the first time since I'd known him, I saw a genuine fear in his eyes. He stared at the map for a long moment, watching the animated replay of detection events spreading across the landscape like a slow-motion infection. And when he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "They're coming here," he said simply. "Whatever these things are, they've been systematically working their way through the park, and we're the target. The question is why? What's at Station 7 that they want?" We spent the rest of that day trying to answer that question, examining everything about our location that might draw attention. Station 7 sat at the edge of what geologists called the Amler Mineral Belt, a region rich in copper, zinc, and rare earth elements that mining companies were increasingly interested in exploiting. Maybe these unknowns were related to some covert resource survey, drones, or specialized equipment testing mineral deposits in ways that generated unusual signatures. But that didn't explain the methodical pattern, or why they'd need to physically approach our station. The other possibility, the one neither of us wanted to voice, was that Station 7 itself was the target, specifically the advanced monitoring equipment we housed. If some foreign intelligence agency had developed stealth technology capable of evading normal detection, they might want to test it against our sensor systems, probe our capabilities, find weaknesses they could exploit. The timing would make sense. Rising Arctic tensions, resource competition, strategic positioning as melting ice opened new shipping routes and territorial claims. Maybe we'd stumbled into the early stages of some kind of Cold War maneuver being conducted in the most remote wilderness on the continent. But even that explanation felt insufficient because stealth technology, no matter how advanced, would show up consistently across all sensor types. These anomalies were different. They registered thermally, but not quite right. They triggered motion sensors, but with unusual patterns. They generated biological signatures that didn't match known parameters. It was as if they were biological and mechanical simultaneously, or something else entirely that our equipment wasn't designed to categorize. That night, October 12th, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my bunk listening to the wind howl across the tundra, rattling the cabin's reinforced walls, and tried to process everything I'd learned. Somewhere out there in the darkness, something was moving toward us with purpose and coordination that suggested intelligence. Whether human, animal, or something else, I couldn't say, but it was coming, and when it arrived, I had no idea what we'd be facing. The satellite data kept streaming in throughout the night, each new detection event adding to the picture of systematic approach. By dawn on October 13th, I'd made a decision. Whatever was heading toward Station 7, I needed to see it with my own eyes, needed to go out into the field and investigate these detection sites directly. The data could only tell us so much. Real understanding required boots on the ground, human observation, and judgment. In a situation where technology was proving inadequate, Harlan tried to talk me out of it, argued that we should wait for the technical specialists. Petin kept promising would arrive. But I'd already waited too long, watched these unknowns creep closer while filing reports that generated nothing but empty acknowledgments. If something was about to happen at Station 7, I wanted to understand what I was facing before it arrived at my doorstep. So I prepared for a field excursion into the sector where the most recent detection events had occurred, a stretch of tundra about 15 mi northeast, where sensors had logged multiple unknowns moving in formation just 36 hours earlier. I packed 3 days of supplies, loaded extra batteries for my equipment, checked my satellite phone, and made sure my emergency beacon was functioning. Harlan would monitor from the station, tracking my position and maintaining radio contact. As I suited up that morning, pulling on layers of insulation against October cold that could kill in minutes if you weren't prepared, I felt the weight of what I was doing settle over me. I was walking into something I didn't understand, chasing thermal ghosts across frozen wilderness, driven by instinct that told me the official explanations weren't going to be sufficient. Deep in my gut, below rational thought, I knew I was about to discover something that would change everything I understood about the territory I'd spent 7 years protecting. The last thing I did before leaving was send one more message to Virgil Pettin, informing him of my field excursion and requesting immediate contact if he had any information that might affect my safety. His response came as I was stepping out the door, and it was different from his previous messages. Less formal, more direct. Exercise extreme caution. Remain in constant communication. If you encounter anything unusual, withdraw immediately and report. Do not attempt direct contact under any circumstances. I stood there in the doorway reading those words on my phone screen while October wind cut through my gear and the vast emptiness of the tundra stretched before me. The message didn't tell me what I might encounter, didn't explain the warnings, didn't provide any useful context, but it confirmed what I'd already suspected. Whatever was moving through the wilderness toward Station 7, federal agencies knew about it and were worried enough to issue warnings while refusing to provide actual information. I stepped outside, closed the reinforced door behind me, and started walking northeast toward answers I wasn't sure I wanted to find. The satellite data had shown me patterns and possibilities. Now I needed to discover what physical reality lay behind those digital ghosts. What presence was marking the wilderness with signatures that match no known animal in our database? Behind me, Station 7 sat solid and isolated against the landscape, its satellite dish turning slowly as it maintained connection to the orbital network that fed us information about everything moving through the park. Ahead of me, 15 miles of tundra stretched empty and silent under gray October skies, hiding something that had spent months systematically working its way toward this location. I was about to find out what happens when a park ranger walks out to meet the unknown, when surveillance technology fails and human investigation becomes necessary, when the comfortable certainty of wildlife monitoring gives way to the cold reality that maybe we don't know as much about the wilderness as we thought we did. And maybe the wilderness contains things that don't want to be known, don't fit into our categories and classifications, and don't care whether we're prepared to acknowledge their existence. The first step into that journey felt heavier than all the ones that would follow. The tundra in October is a study in desolation. The brief summer explosion of life has already retreated south or gone underground, leaving behind a landscape stripped to its essential elements. Brown and gray vegetation compressed against frozen ground, exposed rock faces scoured clean by wind, ice crystals forming in still air, creating a faint glitter that tricks your eyes into seeing movement where there is none. Walking across it feels like crossing the surface of an alien planet, hostile and indifferent to human presence, beautiful in the way that dangerous things often are. I'd covered maybe 5 miles when I started noticing the first signs that something was wrong with the terrain itself. Nothing dramatic, just small details that accumulated into a pattern of wrongness that made the hair on my neck stand up despite layers of insulation. The tundra vegetation, normally random in its distribution, showed areas where it had been disturbed in ways I couldn't immediately explain. Not trampled or torn up the way animal passage would leave it, but compressed in perfect geometric patterns, as if something heavy had rested there with mechanical precision. The shapes were roughly circular, maybe 8 ft in diameter, and whatever had created them had left the plant material intact, but flattened in a way that suggested enormous weight distributed evenly across the entire surface. I knelt beside one of these impressions and ran my gloved hand across it, trying to understand what I was seeing. The vegetation was frozen in its compressed state, suggesting these marks had been made at least several days ago during a cold snap. But there was something else, a faint discoloration in the soil beneath, a darkening that didn't match normal moisture patterns. I pulled out my multi-tool and scraped away some of the frozen plant matter, exposing the ground underneath. The soil had a strange consistency, almost glassy in places, as if it had been subjected to intense heat that melted and refrozen into a semi-crystalline structure. That made no sense. Heat sufficient to alter soil structure would have burned away the vegetation completely, not just compressed it. Yet, here was evidence of both compression and thermal alteration occurring simultaneously or in close sequence. I took photographs from multiple angles, documented the GPS coordinates, and marked the location on my handheld unit before continuing northeast. My radio check-in with Harren was brief. I described what I'd found, and he was silent for a long moment before responding. "That matches something I'm seeing in the satellite thermal history," he said, his voice crackling with static. I pulled archived imaging from the dates when sensors detected those unknowns in your area, and there are residual heat signatures at several locations. Not strong enough to flag at the time, but they're there in the data. Spots of slightly elevated ground temperature that persist for hours after the detection events end, as if something hot was sitting there long enough to warm the permafrost. The implication hung between us without being stated directly. Whatever was moving through the park wasn't just warm-blooded in the normal sense. It was generating enough heat to leave thermal footprints in frozen ground, and doing so while somehow maintaining biological signatures that confused our monitoring systems. I acknowledged his report and kept walking, but my unease was deepening with each step. The next anomaly appeared 3 mi further along my route in a shallow depression where winter runoff would normally collect. The depression was maybe 20 ft across and several feet deep at its center, filled with ice that had formed when autumn temperatures first dropped below freezing. Except the ice wasn't uniform. Part of it showed the normal patterns of gradual freezing layers building up over time, crystal structures following natural thermal gradients. But a section roughly 10 ft long had a completely different character, smooth and clear like glass without the typical cloudiness and fracture lines you'd expect. It looked manufactured, as if someone had poured molten glass into the depression and let it cool into perfect transparency. I approached carefully, testing the surface before putting my full weight on it. And that's when I noticed the shapes beneath the ice. They were dark masses, irregular forms suspended in the clear section like insects trapped in amber. My first thought was animal remains, maybe a caribou that had died and been frozen into the depression before scavengers could reach it. But as I knelt and cleared away the surface snow for a better view, I realized these weren't normal animal remains. The shapes were organic, definitely biological material, but configured in ways that made no anatomical sense. What looked like it might have been a leg was bent at angles impossible for any joint I knew. Something that could have been a rib cage was compressed flat. The individual bones fused together in a solid mass, and there was too much of it. Too much biological material to have come from a single animal, as if multiple creatures had been somehow combined and then compressed into the ice. The preservation was perfect, showing details that shouldn't have survived freezing. Individual cell structures visible through the ice. Colors that should have faded, remaining vibrant. I spent 20 minutes documenting this discovery, taking photographs and video, trying to capture the wrongness of what I was seeing in a way that would translate through a camera lens. The rational part of my brain kept suggesting natural explanations. Perhaps predators had cached multiple kills here, and the subsequent freezing had distorted the remains. Perhaps the clear ice was the result of some unusual weather event that had melted and refrozen the water rapidly. But none of those explanations felt adequate, and the longer I stared at those shapes suspended in impossible ice, the more convinced I became that I was looking at evidence of something actively hostile to normal biological processes. My radio crackled, Harlan's voice cutting through my concentration. "Thaddeus, I'm tracking another detection event in your sector. Same signature pattern as the others, but it's active right now, and it's moving toward your position. Distance approximately 4 m northeast, heading southwest at steady pace. You need to be aware of its trajectory because if it maintains current course and speed, you'll intercept it in about 45 minutes. The information hit me like a physical blow. Whatever these unknowns were, I was about to encounter one directly, and I had less than an hour to decide whether to continue forward or retreat to safer distance. Every protocol I'd been trained to follow said retreat, maintain safe observation distance, let specialized personnel handle close encounters with unknown wildlife. But I'd come out here specifically to see these things with my own eyes, and retreating now would mean accepting that I'd never really understand what I was dealing with. "I'm continuing forward," I said into the radio, hearing the decision solidify as I spoke the words. "But I'm going to find elevated ground where I can observe its approach. Keep tracking and give me updates on position and heading every 5 minutes." Harlan started to object, then seemed to recognize the futility and simply acknowledge the plan. I could hear the concern in his voice, but also understanding. He'd been a ranger long enough to know that sometimes you have to trust your instincts, even when they lead you toward danger. That real knowledge comes from direct observation rather than remote monitoring. He'd have made the same choice if he were out here instead of me. I found what I was looking for about a 4 mile further northeast, an exposed rocky outcrop rising maybe 30 ft above the surrounding tundra. Not much elevation, but enough to give me clear sight lines across several miles of open ground. I climbed to the top, finding a position that offered some shelter from the wind while maintaining visibility, and settled in to wait. The temperature was dropping as afternoon faded toward evening, probably down around 5 degrees F, with wind chill making it feel much colder. I pulled my balaclava up, adjusted my goggles, and focused on controlling my breathing to conserve heat and maintain alertness. Harlan's updates came through right on schedule, each one tracking the unknown as it maintained its steady southwestern course. At 30 minutes, it was 2 miles out. At 35 minutes, 2 miles. The trajectory hadn't varied by more than a few degrees, suggesting purpose rather than random wandering. Whatever this thing was, it knew where it was going and was taking the most direct route to get there. I pulled out my binoculars and began scanning the tundra in the direction Harlan indicated, looking for any sign of movement against the gray-brown landscape. At 42 minutes, I saw it. Just a dark shape at first, visible only because it was moving against the static background, too far away to make out details, but clearly present and approaching. I focused the binoculars, adjusted for distance, and felt my stomach drop as the image resolved into something I could actually see. The shape was wrong. Not obviously wrong in a way I could immediately articulate, but wrong in the way that makes your brain struggle to process what your eyes are reporting. It was large, roughly the size of a grizzly bear, but it moved differently. Too smooth, too fluid, without the characteristic loping gait of any large mammal I'd ever observed. As it came closer, maybe a 4 mile out now, more details became visible, and each one added to the growing sense of wrongness. The shape wasn't quite symmetrical, but the asymmetry followed no anatomical pattern I recognized. What might have been legs seemed too long in proportion to the body, and they moved with a strange articulation that suggested joints bending in wrong directions. The surface, what I could see of it through distance and atmospheric distortion, didn't look like fur or hide, but had a quality that reminded me more of the smooth ice I'd found in the Depression. Almost reflective, catching light in ways that biological surfaces shouldn't. I grabbed my thermal imaging scope, the handheld unit we used for night wildlife observation, and trained it on the approaching shape. The display showed exactly what I'd expected based on the satellite data, a heat signature that was all wrong for a living animal. Instead of a concentrated warm core with cooler extremities, the thermal image showed an even distribution of heat across the entire form, as if every part of it was the same temperature. And that temperature was higher than it should have been. Somewhere around 95 degrees F, when most Arctic mammals maintain core temperatures between 100 and 102 degrees. It was too cold to be alive in any conventional sense, but too warm to be an inanimate object reflecting ambient temperature. The shape continued its approach, now less than 1/8 of a mile away, and I could see it wasn't alone. 2 more appeared behind it, following the same trajectory with the same disturbing fluidity of movement. They maintained precise spacing, maybe 50 ft between them, suggesting coordination that went beyond simple pack behavior. This was organized, systematic, almost military in its precision. I felt my heart rate accelerating despite my efforts to remain calm, and I had to consciously focus on keeping my hands steady as I documented everything with my camera. At 100 yards, I could make out something that might have been a head, though it bore little resemblance to any animal skull structure I knew. It was too smooth, lacking the normal prominence of eyes, ears, muzzle, all the features that define mammalian heads. Instead, there was just a streamlined shape that seemed to flow directly into what might have been shoulders without any clear delineation. And as I watched through the binoculars, I realized the surface was doing something that made my skin crawl beneath all my insulation. It was shifting, moving in slow waves like liquid contained by an invisible membrane, never quite settling into a stable form. They passed within 75 yards of my position, close enough that I could hear them despite the wind. Not breathing sounds, not footfalls on frozen ground, but a low-frequency hum that I felt more than heard, a vibration that seemed to resonate in my chest and made my teeth ache. The sound wasn't constant, but pulsed in regular intervals, maybe once every 3 seconds, suggesting some kind of internal rhythm or process that had nothing to do with respiration or heartbeat. I held absolutely still, barely breathing, hoping the elevation and downwind position would prevent them from detecting my presence. The lead shape paused, and for one terrible moment I thought it had sensed me. It didn't turn toward my position, didn't show any obvious signs of alarm, but it stopped moving and the surface ripples intensified, waves of motion passing across its form faster and with more violence. The 2 shapes behind it stopped as well, maintaining their precise spacing, and the humming sound changed pitch, becoming higher, more urgent. I watched through the binoculars, every muscle tensed as the lead shape seemed to extend something from what I'd been thinking of as its head. A projection maybe 3 ft long, thin, and pointed that swept back and forth like an antenna searching for signal. Then it retracted the projection, resumed its smooth movement, and continued southwest along its original trajectory. The other 2 followed, and within another minute they'd passed beyond my observation point, heading deeper into the sector toward Station 7. I stayed frozen in position for a full 5 minutes after they disappeared from sight, afraid that any movement might draw their attention back, afraid that they'd somehow detected me and were circling around to approach from a different angle. But my radio remained silent, except for Harlan's steady updates, tracking them as they moved away. And eventually, I allowed myself to believe they'd passed without registering my presence. My hands were shaking when I finally lowered the binoculars, and it wasn't from cold. I just watched something that violated every principle of biology I understood. Something that moved and generated heat and displayed coordinated behavior, but didn't conform to any pattern of life I'd been trained to recognize. The satellite data had shown me anomalies, but seeing them physically present in the landscape, moving with purpose across terrain I thought I knew, shattered the comfortable distance that data provides. I radioed Harlan with the full description of what I'd observed, hearing my own voice sound shaky and uncertain as I struggled to find words adequate to convey what I'd seen. He listened without interruption, and when I finished, his response was quiet and carefully measured. I've been going through archived data while you've been out there, pulling up every anomalous reading from the past 8 months and mapping their movements, that Thaddeus. They're not just moving towards Station 7. They're surrounding it. Multiple groups approaching from different directions, all converging on a rough circle with our position at the center. Whatever's happening, it's coordinated across a huge area, and we're right in the middle of it. The implications were staggering and terrifying. This wasn't random animal behavior or even predator pack hunting. This was an organized operation conducted by entities that could plan, coordinate, and execute complex maneuvers across vast distances. And Station 7 was their target for reasons I couldn't begin to guess. I made a decision in that moment, one that probably violated several federal regulations, but felt absolutely necessary. I'm staying out here tonight, I told Heron. I need to track where they go, see if there are more of them, understand their patterns better. If they're surrounding the station, I want to be out here observing rather than sitting inside waiting for whatever comes next. Harlan argued, pointed out the dangers of overnight exposure in October temperatures, reminded me of protocols requiring tours and teams for extended field operations. But I could hear in his voice that he understood the necessity, and eventually he agreed to maintain radio contact through the night and monitor my position continuously via satellite tracking. I found a more sheltered position among the rocks, set up my bivouac with emergency heating elements, and prepared to spend the night watching shapes that shouldn't exist, move through wilderness that suddenly felt far less familiar than it had that morning. As darkness fell and October cold settled deeper into the landscape, I reviewed the thermal imaging footage I'd captured and noticed something I'd missed during the initial observation. In several frames, when the shapes passed over snow patches, they left marks, not footprints in any conventional sense, but impressions that matched the geometric patterns I'd found earlier. Perfect circles where the snow had melted and immediately refrozen into glassy ice. Whatever contact these things made with the ground generated enough heat to flash melt snow, yet their thermal signatures registered well below normal body temperature for living animals. That contradiction bothered me more than anything else I'd observed. Heat that could melt snow, but thermal readings showing something barely warm. Movement suggesting life, but forms that violated biological principles. Coordination indicating intelligence, but absence of any features that would house a brain in the conventional sense. I was looking at evidence that challenged fundamental assumptions about what constitutes a living organism. And the more I tried to fit these observations into existing frameworks, the more inadequate those frameworks became. Around midnight, my thermal scope picked up more movement. Another group of 3 shapes passing through the sector several miles to the east. I tracked them until they moved beyond range, noting that they maintained the same formation and heading as the group I'd observed earlier. Harlan confirmed the detection through satellite sensors and reported similar groups moving in from the north and west. By his count, at least 15 separate entities had been tracked converging towards Station 7, and those were just the ones large enough and warm enough to trigger our monitoring systems. There could be more, smaller or cooler, moving beneath our detection thresholds. I tried to sleep in rotating shifts, staying alert for an hour, then resting for 30 minutes. But real sleep was impossible. Every sound made me tense. Every shift in wind direction made me reach for my thermal scope. The tundra at night is never truly silent. Ice contracts with sharp cracks. Wind moves across obstacles with varying tones. Small animals, the few that remain active through winter, make their quick movements through the darkness. But tonight, every sound seemed potentially significant, possibly indicating the approach of something that didn't belong in the natural soundscape. The longest night of my life ended with gray October dawn, revealing a landscape that looked unchanged, but felt fundamentally different. I'd spent hours watching unknown entities move through territory I thought I knew. And that experience had transformed the wilderness from familiar to threatening. As I packed my gear and prepared to return to Station 7, I understood that whatever I reported, whatever evidence I'd gathered, would raise more questions than it answered. These things moving through the park weren't animals in any conventional sense, weren't machines in any recognizable configuration, but occupied some category our classifications couldn't accommodate. The hike back took most of the morning, with me stopping frequently to examine more of the geometric impressions and melted refrozen areas that marked the passage of these unknowns. Each site added details to the emerging picture, showing patterns of movement that suggested purpose and destination. They weren't wandering. They weren't hunting. They were executing a plan that involved systematic coverage of specific terrain, and that plan was nearing completion. When I finally made it back to Station 7, exhausted and chilled despite all my gear, Harlan met me at the door with an expression that mixed relief and fear. Before I could even get inside, he handed me his tablet showing the latest satellite tracking data. The shapes I'd observed, along with dozens of others that had been detected overnight, had all stopped moving. They'd taken positions forming a rough circle approximately 5 mi in diameter, with Station 7 at the exact center, and they'd been stationary for the past 3 hours. "They're just sitting there," Harlan said quietly. "Not moving, not dispersing, just maintaining position in a perfect perimeter around us. And Thaddeus, I finally got through to Petin with your field observations. He's sending a team, but they won't arrive for at least 36 hours. Whatever these things are planning to do, we're going to be alone when it happens." I looked at the tracking display, seeing the ring of unknown signals surrounding our position, and felt the weight of understanding settle over me. This wasn't about wildlife monitoring anymore. This wasn't about unexplained thermal signatures or biological anomalies. This was about being trapped at the center of something planned and coordinated by intelligences we didn't understand. And the next phase of whatever operation they were conducting was about to begin. The federal team arrived 31 hours after Harlan's call to Petin, landing in 2 black helicopters that came in fast and low over the tundra like military extraction birds. I watched them approach from the cabin window, tracking their descent through binoculars. And what struck me immediately was the hardware they were carrying. This wasn't a scientific research team. These were people prepared for a combat situation, wearing tactical gear that looked more appropriate for overseas deployment than wildlife investigation. Body armor, helmets with integrated communications, weapons that I recognized as modified for specialized ammunition and equipment cases, that suggested they'd brought enough gear to sustain operations in hostile territory for an extended period. 6 people climbed out of the helicopters once they'd touched down in the cleared area we used for supply deliveries. 5 of them moved with that distinctive operator efficiency, scanning surroundings, establishing security perimeter, communicating through hand signals with the kind of coordination that comes from extensive training and field experience together. The 6th was different, older, moving with academic deliberation rather than tactical precision. She wore civilian cold weather gear and carried what looked like a reinforced laptop case instead of a weapon. As the helicopters lifted off and disappeared south, the tactical team formed up around her, and they approached Station 7 with the careful advance of people entering potentially compromised territory. Harlan opened the door before they could knock, and the woman stepped forward, pulling down her balaclava to reveal a weathered face in her late 50s with sharp gray eyes that assessed everything in quick analytical sweeps. When she spoke, her voice carried the flat authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Dr. Miriam Voss, Applied Sciences Division. You must be Ambrose Fenn and Harlan Cutler. We need to conduct a full debrief immediately, and then I'll need access to all your monitoring data, raw feeds, satellite archives, everything your system has recorded for the past 12 months. My security team will establish a defensive perimeter while we work. I understand you've had direct visual contact with the entities. That makes you the only non-classified personnel to have observed them and survived the encounter without immediate retrieval. The phrasing caught my attention immediately. Without immediate retrieval, it implied there were other personnel who'd had encounters, and those encounters had ended with them being taken somewhere for reasons Voss wasn't explaining. I glanced at Harlan and saw the same realization register in his expression, but neither of us challenged her statement. We simply stepped back and let the men enter, watching as the tactical team immediately began setting up equipment that transformed our modest research station into something resembling a forward operating base. The debrief took 3 hours, with Voss recording everything while her laptop processed information faster than I could track. She wanted every detail, every observation, every measurement and photograph I'd captured during my field excursion. When I described the shapes moving across the tundra, she stopped me repeatedly to clarify specific aspects of their appearance, movement patterns, thermal characteristics. She was particularly interested in the humming sound I'd heard, making me describe its frequency, rhythm, and how it had made me feel physically. When I mentioned the sensation of vibration in my chest and the aching in my teeth, she exchanged a look with one of the tactical team members that suggested this detail, confirmed something they'd already suspected. The entities generate a low-frequency acoustic signature that affects human physiology, she said, typing notes as she spoke. Most people experience it as discomfort or unease, a warning system that evolved to alert us to danger we can't consciously identify. A small percentage experience it more severely with actual tissue vibration that can cause internal injuries at close range. The fact that you felt it at 75 YD suggests they were in an active scanning mode using acoustic pulses to map their environment. You're fortunate they didn't identify you as a significant target. I wanted to ask what she meant by significant target. What criteria these things use to determine threat levels, but she'd already moved on to the next set of questions. The interrogation, and that's really what it was, continued until she'd extracted every possible detail from my observations. Only then did she lean back, close her laptop, and make a decision I could see forming behind her analytical gaze. What I'm about to tell you is classified under authorities that supersede normal security protocols. You've earned access through direct contact, but understand that disclosure of this information to unauthorized personnel will result in immediate federal detention and prosecution under laws most people don't know exist. Acknowledge that you understand these terms. We both acknowledged, and Voss pulled out a tablet from her case, calling up files that carried classification markers I'd never seen before. Not the standard confidential secret top secret hierarchy, but designations that looked more like mathematical coordinates than security levels. She turned the screen so we could see, and what appeared were satellite images of the Brooks Range taken from orbit, but processed in ways that revealed details invisible to normal observation. The entities you encountered are designated Type 7 autonomous biological analogs. We've been tracking them for approximately 14 months since they first appeared in the northern coastal regions of Alaska. Their origin is unknown. Their purpose is unknown. What we do know is that they're not natural organisms in any conventional sense, and they're not technological constructs in any way we can define. They exist in a category our science isn't equipped to classify, exhibiting properties of both organic life and organized machinery while conforming to the rules of neither. The images on her tablet showed thermal signatures similar to what I'd observed, but these were taken from directly overhead with much higher resolution. I could see the internal structure of the entities, or rather I could see that there was no internal structure in any recognizable sense. No organs, no skeletal framework, no differentiation between different tissue types, just homogeneous mass that generated heat and moved with purpose, held together by mechanisms the imaging couldn't penetrate or identify. We believe they're conducting a systematic survey of the Alaskan interior. Voss continued, switching to a map that showed detection events plotted over time. The pattern I discovered in the archived data was even clearer at this scale, showing waves of activity spreading from multiple origin points along the coast, gradually penetrating deeper into the continental interior. They're mapping terrain, analyzing geological features, cataloging biological populations, and possibly searching for something specific. Station 7 sits at a convergence point where multiple survey routes intersect, which is why they've concentrated here. But we don't know what happens when they complete their survey, whether they'll withdraw, continue to other regions, or transition to some secondary phase of operation. Harlan spoke up for the first time since the debrief began, his voice carrying the weight of weeks spent watching these unknowns approach our position. You're talking about them like they're an invasion force conducting reconnaissance before an attack. Is that what we're dealing with here? Some kind of first contact scenario gone wrong? Boss's expression remained neutral, but I caught the slight hesitation before she answered. The momentary calculation of how much to reveal. We don't have sufficient evidence to characterize their activities as hostile or preparatory to hostility. But we also can't rule out that possibility. What's clear is that they're operating according to a plan that was conceived by intelligence of some kind, whether individual or collective, terrestrial or otherwise. And Station 7, with its advanced monitoring equipment and communication systems, represents exactly the kind of strategic asset that any survey operation would want to investigate or neutralize. That's when I understood why they'd brought a tactical team instead of just scientists. Voss expected the entities to make a move on the station, and when they did, she intended to capture or destroy at least one of them for detailed study. Station 7 wasn't just an observation post anymore. It had become bait in a trap, and Heron and I were the expendable personnel who gave the trap credibility. "I need to know what we're really up against," I said, hearing the edge in my own voice. "You've been tracking these things for 14 months. You've got classified files and specialized teams and equipment designed specifically for this situation. That means you've encountered them before, probably multiple times. What happened in those encounters? What have you learned that you're not telling us? Voss studied me for a long moment, and I could see her weighing operational security against the practical necessity of keeping the people at Ground Zero informed enough to survive. Finally, she made a decision and pulled up another file. This one, marked with warning labels, suggesting the content was considered particularly sensitive. 3 months ago, we established a monitoring post similar to this one in the Yukon Territory, staffed by 4 researchers and 2 security personnel. The entities surrounded it exactly as they've surrounded Station 7. We maintained remote observation, watching their approach pattern, trying to understand their methodology. On the 3rd night of encirclement, the entities stopped maintaining their perimeter positions and converged on the post simultaneously. The assault, if we can call it that, lasted approximately 7 minutes. By the time it was over, the monitoring post was gone. She let that statement hang in the air, watching our reactions. I felt my stomach tighten, understanding the implication but needing her to confirm it explicitly. Gone? How destroyed, overrun, gone, Voss repeated flatly. The structure was removed completely. Not torn apart, not burned down, not dismantled, removed as if it had been excised from reality with surgical precision. The foundation remained undamaged. The surrounding terrain showed no signs of violence or struggle, but the building and everything inside it, including all 6 personnel, simply ceased to exist in that location. Satellite thermal imaging showed the entities clustered around the post during the event, generating synchronized pulses of energy or activity that our sensors couldn't properly characterize. And then they dispersed, resuming their survey pattern as if nothing had happened. The room was silent except for the wind outside and the quiet hum of monitoring equipment. Harlan looked like he'd been physically struck, his face pale beneath his weathered tan. I felt disconnected from my own body hearing Voss's words, but struggling to integrate them with anything resembling a comprehensible reality. Buildings don't just vanish. People don't cease to exist without leaving remains, but Voss was describing exactly that. And her matter-of fact delivery suggested this wasn't speculation or theory, but documented observation. "Did you recover anything?" Harlan asked, his voice rough. "Any trace of the structure or the people? Any evidence of where it went?" Voss shook her head. The site remained under observation for 2 weeks. Ground teams conducted extensive analysis using equipment sensitive enough to detect individual molecules. We found nothing that indicated the presence of a building had ever existed there. No chemical residue, no disturbed soil beyond the original foundation excavation, no biological traces from the personnel. Whatever mechanism these entities used, it removed matter completely and left no forensic signature we could identify. She closed that file and opened another showing what looked like classified military reports with heavy redaction. That was the most complete removal event we've documented, but it wasn't the first. Over the past year, we've lost 7 research installations, 12 field teams, and 43 individual personnel to various forms of entity interaction. Some vanished, like the Yukon Post. Others were found altered in ways that suggest the entities can manipulate biological matter at the molecular level. And in 2 cases, we recovered personnel who'd been exposed to the entities and subsequently demonstrated changes in neural activity that we're still trying to understand. The implications were staggering and horrifying. We weren't dealing with something that killed like a predator or destroyed like a force of nature. We were dealing with something that could remove people and structures from existence, alter human biology in fundamental ways, and operate according to principles so far outside our understanding that our monitoring equipment couldn't properly measure their activities. and Station 7 was sitting at ground zero of their next convergence point. "So why are we still here?" I asked, trying to keep my voice level. "If you know what happened to that Yukon post, why haven't you evacuated us in this station? Why are you using us as bait?" Boss's expression finally showed something other than clinical detachment, a flash of what might have been regret or possibly respect, because we need to understand what triggers the removal events. The Yukon post was purely observational, passive monitoring with no active sensor sweeps or communication transmissions. We need to know if the entities respond differently to active engagement, whether they're drawn to electromagnetic activity or if their targeting is based on other criteria. And because every installation we've studied has been military or government, we need data from a civilian facility that's been operating normally without awareness of entity presence. Station 7 has been broadcasting routine telemetry, running active sensor scans, transmitting data to Fairbanks on regular schedules. If the entities distinguish between operational profiles, this is how we'll learn it. And if they don't distinguish, Harlan asked quietly, if they just remove us the same way they removed that Yukon post, then we'll have confirmation that the removal events aren't selective based on activity profile, and we'll adjust our defensive strategies accordingly. Either way, this encounter provides critical data that we desperately need. Voss stood up, gathering her equipment. My team has established sensor arrays around the perimeter that will give us comprehensive coverage of any approach. If the entities begin converging, we'll have approximately 30 minutes warning based on their observed movement speeds. That should be sufficient time to implement defensive measures or execute evacuation if necessary. In the meantime, I need to analyze your monitoring data against our classified archives and see if there are patterns we've missed. The tactical team spent the rest of the day transforming Station 7 into something that felt more like a siege fortress than a research facility. They installed additional power generators to support defensive systems, positioned equipment that looked like directed energy weapons at strategic locations, and established overlapping fields of observation that would alert them to any movement within 2 mi of our position. The team leader, a hard-faced man in his 40s who introduced himself simply as Kovac, briefed us on emergency procedures with the kind of grim efficiency that suggested he'd extracted people from worse situations and didn't expect this one to end well. As evening approached and October darkness settled over the tundra, I found myself standing outside watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of red and purple that seemed too beautiful for the situation we were facing. The entities were out there maintaining their perimeter, waiting for something or preparing for something, following a plan that we couldn't predict or prevent. I thought about those 43 people who'd vanished or been altered, wondered if they'd stood like I was standing now, watching the sky and trying to comprehend what was coming for them. Dr. Voss joined me, carrying a cup of coffee that steamed in the cold air. For a moment, she was silent, just standing beside me and watching the light fade. Then she spoke quietly in a tone very different from her clinical briefing voice. "I don't expect you to trust me or forgive the fact that you've been positioned as bait without your knowledge or consent. But I want you to understand that every person we've lost to these entities has contributed to our understanding in ways that might eventually save thousands or millions. Whatever happens here tonight or in the coming days, your observations and your sacrifice, if it comes to that, matter more than you can imagine." I didn't answer immediately, processing what she'd said and what she'd left unsaid. Finally, I turned to look at her directly. "You think they're the advanced element of something bigger, don't you? You think this survey they're conducting is preparation for something that makes losing a few dozen researchers seem like an acceptable cost?" Voss met my gaze, and in her eyes I saw confirmation that my guess had hit close to whatever truth she was protecting. I think we're in the early stages of contact with something that operates on scales and according to principles we're not equipped to understand. And I think the worst mistake we could make would be assuming that our conventional frameworks for understanding life, intelligence, and purpose have any relevance to what we're dealing with. So yes, I'm willing to position people in dangerous situations to gather data, because the alternative is facing the next phase of contact completely blind. She walked back inside before I could respond, leaving me alone with the darkening sky and the knowledge that somewhere beyond the visible horizon, entities that violated every rule of biology and physics were maintaining their patient vigil around our position. The tactical team had set up external monitors that showed thermal imaging of the perimeter, and I could see them out there. 17 distinct heat signatures arranged in an almost perfect circle, motionless and waiting. The first sign that something was changing came at 11:47 that night. I was monitoring the sensor displays with Kovac when all 17 entities began moving simultaneously, not toward Station 7, but in coordinated circular patterns around their perimeter positions. The movement was synchronized with precision that would have been impressive from trained human operators, but from things that had no visible means of communication, it was deeply unsettling. They maintained perfect timing, completing full rotations every 90 seconds, creating what looked almost like a ritualized dance around our position. Voss came to the monitors immediately when we alerted her, watching the thermal displays with intense focus. She pulled out her tablet and began comparing what we were seeing to classified files, searching for matches with behavior observed in previous encounters. Her expression grew increasingly troubled as the comparison continued, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried an urgency that hadn't been there during her earlier briefings. This matches the pattern that preceded the Yukon removal event. They're not just positioning anymore. They're preparing, building towards something. Kovac, I need your team at full alert. Vera Cutler, you need to gather essential personal items and be ready for immediate evacuation if I give the order. We have maybe 20 minutes before they transition to the next phase, and I don't know if our defensive measures will be sufficient. The tactical team moved into position with practiced efficiency. Weapons trained outward, attention focused on the entity positions. I grabbed my pack and stuffed it with the documentation I'd compiled, making sure the photographs and video from my field observations were stored on multiple drives. Harlan was doing the same, moving with the mechanical focus of someone operating on training rather than conscious thought. Outside, the entities continued their synchronized rotation, and the humming sound I'd heard during my field encounter began resonating through the cabin walls, faint but building, making the floor vibrate beneath our feet. Then, at 12:03, one of the entities broke formation. It detached from the perimeter and began moving directly toward the Station 7. Its approach steady and purposeful. Within seconds, 2 more broke away, then 4. Then all 17 were converging, maintaining their synchronized movement but now directed inward. The humming sound intensified, becoming a physical pressure that made my ears ring and my vision blur at the edges. On the thermal displays, I could see the entities weren't just approaching. They were changing, their heat signatures pulsing in coordinated rhythms, growing brighter and more defined. Kovac's team opened fire when the entities reached the 1 marker. Energy weapons that should have been classified themselves, delivering pulses of directed force that lit up the night. The impacts were visible on thermal imaging, hitting the entity's center mass. And for a moment, I thought the defensive measures were working because the lead entity stopped advancing. But then I realized it hadn't been stopped by the weapon's fire. It had stopped voluntarily, and the other entities were stopping as well, forming a new perimeter just outside the range of our defensive systems. "They're learning our capabilities," Voss said quietly, her voice barely audible over the humming. "They're testing our responses and adjusting their approach accordingly. This is reconnaissance behavior, tactical intelligence gathering before a coordinated assault. The entities maintained their new positions for exactly 3 minutes. And during that time, the humming sound changed frequency, climbing higher until it became almost painful. I could feel it in my bones, in my teeth, in the soft tissues of my organs vibrating at frequencies that organic matter wasn't designed to withstand. Blood started trickling from my nose, and I saw similar signs on Harlan and several of the tactical team members. The entities were weaponizing sound, using acoustic pressure to disable us before they ever made physical contact. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the humming stopped. The entities began withdrawing, moving back to their original perimeter positions with the same synchronized precision. Within 5 minutes, they'd resumed their stationary positions, and the night returned to relative silence, except for the wind and the pounding of my heart. I stood there with blood still dripping from my nose, trying to understand what had just happened, whether we'd survived an attack or simply witnessed a test. Voss was back at her monitors, reviewing the data from the encounter with focused intensity. When she finally looked up, her expression was grim. They were measuring our defensive response, testing how we react to coordinated approach and acoustic assault, and they've withdrawn to analyze what they learned before attempting a real breach. We have maybe 6 to 12 hours before they try again, and next time they'll have adjusted their tactics to counter everything they observed tonight. She turned to Kovac. "I'm implementing emergency evacuation protocol. Get your team and the Rangers ready for immediate extraction. I'm calling in air support with authorization to use extreme measures if the entities attempt to interfere with evacuation." But before Kovac could acknowledge the order, one of his team members, a younger operative named Ferris, who'd been monitoring a different sensor array, called out with alarm in his voice. "We've got a problem. One of the entities isn't on the perimeter anymore. It's showing up on ground sensors underground moving toward the station through the permafrost. And there's something else. We're getting thermal readings from below the cabin. Heat signatures that weren't there an hour ago. Something's underneath us." The realization hit everyone simultaneously. While we'd been focused on the perimeter threat, watching the entities conduct their coordinated approach above ground, at least one had found a way beneath our defenses. It was under Station 7 right now, and the heat signature suggested it was doing something to the Foundation, possibly preparing to implement the same removal mechanism that had eliminated the Yukon post. Boss made a decision in seconds. Evacuate now. Leave the equipment. Leave everything. Just get out of the structure immediately. She grabbed her laptop and headed for the door. But she'd taken only 3 steps when the floor beneath her feet began to change. The solid wood planking that had supported Station 7 for 7 years started to lose its substance, becoming translucent, then transparent, then simply absent. Voss stumbled as the surface beneath her vanished, and I lunged forward on instinct, grabbing her arm and pulling her back toward the solid floor that was retreating like a tide going out. We made it to the door with Harlan and Kovac right behind us. But 3 of the tactical team members, including Ferris, were on the wrong side of the expanding void. They tried to run, but the floor was disappearing faster than they could move. And then they were falling, not down into the space below the cabin, but into something else, some impossible distance that opened up where the floor had been. Their screams lasted maybe 2 seconds before cutting off completely. And when I looked back, all I could see was darkness where they'd been. Darkness that had depth and dimension, but somehow existed in a space too small to contain it. We got outside just as the walls began following the floor into non-existence. the entire structure collapsing inward without sound or violence, just ceasing to be in a way that violated every principle of physics I understood. The ground beneath where Station 7 had stood remained solid and undisturbed, but everything that had been built upon it was gone, erased completely as if it had never existed. And the 3 team members who'd fallen into that impossible void were gone with it, removed from reality with the same surgical precision Voss had described happening to the Yukon post. The surviving tactical team members had their weapons trained on the ground, searching for the entity that had done this, but the thermal sensors showed nothing. Whatever had been underneath us had vanished as completely as Station 7 itself, leaving only the shocked survivors standing on frozen ground where a reinforced research cabin had existed seconds earlier. Voss was on her radio immediately, calling for emergency extraction, her voice maintaining professional control despite the blood running down her face from where she'd hit the ground when I'd pulled her back from the void. Kovac had his team forming a defensive perimeter, but they looked shaken, their tactical training inadequate for dealing with threats that could remove reality itself. Harlan stood beside me, staring at the empty foundation with an expression of stunned disbelief. "They didn't attack us," he said quietly. "They removed our position like we were pieces on a game board that needed to be eliminated to proceed to the next move. Those people didn't die. They didn't even get killed. They just stopped existing in any location we can access." The entities maintained their perimeter positions, showing no reaction to what their underground operative had accomplished. They just waited, patient and implacable, while we stood on frozen ground with nowhere to shelter and no equipment to monitor their next move. And I understood with absolute certainty that this was just the beginning of whatever they'd come to accomplish. That Station 7 had been a minor obstacle cleared away as they continued their survey towards some purpose we hadn't begun to comprehend. Extraction helicopters were inbound. Boss reported ETA 23 minutes. 23 minutes standing exposed on the tundra while entities that could erase buildings and people maintained their vigil around us. The longest 23 minutes any of us would ever experience if we survived them at all. The helicopters never made it to us. We heard them coming, the distinctive thump of rotors cutting through Arctic night growing louder as they approached from the south. Kovac had his team ready for extraction, thermal gear packed, weapons secured. Dr. Voss was on the radio coordinating approach vectors, guiding the pilots around the entity perimeter. Everything was proceeding according to protocol, and for maybe 30 seconds I actually believed we were going to get out of there. Then the lead helicopter's engine noise changed. Developed a stuttering quality that every pilot knows means catastrophic failure. Through the darkness, I could see its running lights beginning to spiral. The aircraft losing altitude in a controlled descent that became less controlled with each passing second. The pilot was fighting it, trying to auto-rotate down, but something was interfering with the mechanics themselves. The helicopter hit the tundra about a mile east of our position, hard enough that we felt the impact through the frozen ground. It didn't explode like in the movies. It just crumpled, metal folding in on itself with a sound like a massive door slamming shut. The second helicopter immediately banked away, the pilot's voice crackling over Voss's radio with barely controlled panic. "We've got complete systems failure, multiple instruments going haywire, electromagnetic interference off the scale. Cannot maintain approach. Repeating, cannot maintain approach. Whatever you've got down there is throwing out enough energy to fry every circuit in this bird." We watched the second helicopter retreat south, its lights disappearing into the night, and the reality of our situation settled over us with the weight of permafrost. We were stranded at ground zero of an entity operation we didn't understand, with no shelter, no equipment, and no extraction possible until whatever was interfering with the helicopters stopped. The temperature was dropping toward -20 Fahrenheit, and without the cabin, we had maybe 6 hours before exposure became the immediate threat instead of the entities. Voss was already on the radio again, calling for ground extraction teams. But the nearest personnel were in Fairbanks, at least 16 hours away, even with emergency authorization. She closed the connection and turned to face us, her expression showing the calculation of someone making decisions with no good options. "We need to reach the crash site and see if there are survivors," she said. "And we need to determine what caused the system's failure. If the entities can project electromagnetic interference strong enough to down aircraft, that's a capability we haven't documented, and one that Command needs to know about immediately." Kovac didn't argue, just organized his remaining team members, and we started moving east toward where the helicopter had gone down. The entities maintained their perimeter positions, not reacting to our movement, not adjusting their formation. They just watched, patient and implacable, as we stumbled across frozen tundra toward a crash that might have survivors we could save, or might be another trap in whatever operation they were conducting. We found the helicopter embedded in the ground at an angle that shouldn't have been survivable, but somehow the crew compartment had remained partially intact. 2 pilots were dead, their bodies showing injuries consistent with high-impact trauma. But the crew chief was alive, barely trapped in wreckage with both legs crushed. Kovac's team worked to free him while I helped Voss search the helicopter systems, trying to understand what had caused the failure. What we found made no sense. The helicopter's electronics hadn't been fried by external interference. They'd been altered, physically changed at the component level. Circuit boards showed signs of molecular reorganization, as if something had reached into the solid-state electronics and rearranged the atomic structure. Wiring had fused in patterns that suggested deliberate sabotage rather than random failure. And throughout the affected systems, there was residue, a faint crystalline deposit that glowed with dim phosphorescence under our flashlights. Voss scraped a sample into a collection vial, her hands shaking slightly as she worked. "This is the same material we found at the Yukon site," she said quietly. "Molecular signatures that don't match anything in our databases. The entities aren't just removing things or altering biological matter. They're manipulating technology at the fundamental level, rewriting the rules that govern how materials function." I was about to respond when Harlan, who'd been watching our perimeter, called out urgently, "They're moving, all of them simultaneously." We looked up to see the entity perimeter collapsing inward, all 17 signatures converging on our position with that same synchronized precision. But they weren't approaching quickly, weren't rushing to attack. They were advancing at walking pace, deliberate and measured like pallbearers in a funeral procession, and the humming had started again, lower frequency this time, resonating through the ground itself rather than the air. Kovac made the call immediately. "We can't carry the crew chief and fight simultaneously. Defensive formation, prepare to engage on my mark." His team formed up, weapons trained on the approaching entities, while Voss pulled me aside with an intensity that suggested what she was about to say would change everything. "I lied to you about the nature of these entities," she said, words coming fast. "Not about what they can do, but about what they are. We've known since the 2nd month of observation. They're not alien in the sense of coming from another planet. They're from Earth, from deep beneath the Arctic ice sheet. Drilling operations discovered them 3 years ago, dormant in cavities that have existed for millions of years. When we exposed them to atmosphere, they activated everything. Since then, all the tracking and monitoring and lost installations has been us trying to contain a mistake we made by drilling where we shouldn't have." The revelation hit me like physical force, recontextualizing everything I'd observed. These weren't invaders from space conducting a survey. They were something ancient that we'd awakened. something that had been buried beneath Arctic ice before humans existed, and now they were reclaiming territory that had once been theirs before the world changed and buried them in frozen darkness. "They're not attacking us," Voss continued, her voice urgent as the entities closed to within 300 YD. "They're studying us, trying to understand what replaced them while they were dormant. Every installation they've removed, every person they've altered has been part of their effort to comprehend what Earth has become. And I think they're about to make a decision about whether humanity is compatible with whatever plans they have for reactivation." The entities stopped advancing at 200 Y, forming a circle around our position. The humming reached a crescendo that made my vision blur and my bones ache. And then it stopped completely. In the sudden silence, one entity detached from the formation and continued forward alone, moving toward us with what I could only interpret as deliberate intention to communicate. Kovac was ready to fire, but Voss held up her hand. "Wait, let it approach. This might be the only chance we get to establish contact." The entity stopped 50 FT away, and for the first time I could see it clearly in the glow of our flashlights. It was even more disturbing up close, a shape that suggested life without conforming to biological principles, movement without visible mechanism. And as I watched, it began to change. The surface rippling and reshaping, forming structures that took me a moment to recognize as crude approximations of human features. Eyes, mouth, the basic configuration of a face emerging from formless mass. Then it spoke not through the approximation of a mouth, but directly into our minds with the same telepathic pressure I'd felt as vibration. The words weren't in any language, but arrived as pure meaning that bypassed normal linguistic processing. "Survey complete. Classification determined. You are temporary. We are permanent. Transition beginning." That was all. 4 statements that carried implications vast enough to encompass the end of human civilization as we understood it. The entity withdrew, rejoining the formation, and all 17 began moving away, not dispersing, but traveling together in a coordinated group headed northwest toward the Brooks Range interior. Within minutes, they disappeared beyond our observation range, and we were left standing in the wreckage of a helicopter crash with more questions than we'd started with, and the knowledge that whatever transition they'd referenced was already underway. We extracted the injured crew chief and made our way back to where Station 7 had stood, waiting through the longest night of our lives for ground teams that would eventually arrive with more questions we couldn't answer. Dr. Voss filed her reports, Kovac submitted his after-action analysis, and Harlan and I gave our statements to investigators who didn't believe half of what we told them. But here's what keeps me awake now, 3 months later, sitting in a federal facility where they've detained me for protective observation while they decide how much I'm allowed to remember. The entities are still out there. Satellite tracking shows them spreading across the Arctic, their numbers increasing as more dormant specimens activate in response to rising temperatures and continued drilling operations. The survey they conducted wasn't reconnaissance for an invasion. It was an assessment of how much the world has changed since they went dormant, and whether the current inhabitants, us, are obstacles to be removed or resources to be utilized in whatever comes next. I think about that word they used, transition. I think about the 43 people who were altered rather than removed, who came back changed in ways the authorities won't discuss. I think about the installations that vanished and the technology that got rewritten at the molecular level. And I wonder if the transition they're implementing is happening to all of us slowly, imperceptibly, rewriting humanity at depths we can't detect until the changes become irreversible. They tell me I'll be released soon once the debriefing is complete, and they're satisfied I'm not a security risk. But I can feel something different in my body lately. Subtle changes in perception and cognition that remind me of how Voss described the altered personnel. My dreams are full of humming sounds and geometric patterns. I catch myself thinking in frequencies rather than words. And sometimes when I look at my reflection, I see something moving beneath the surface, patient and purposeful, waiting for the transition to complete. The entities aren't gone. They're beneath the ice in the permafrost, possibly inside those of us who encountered them directly. They're permanent and were temporary, and the survey has determined exactly how that transition will proceed. Station 7 is gone. 3 team members vanished into impossible voids. A helicopter crew died because their technology got rewritten, and something ancient that humans accidentally awakened is reclaiming Earth. One mind, one body, one installation at a time. The satellite signals never matched any animal because they weren't animals. They were the landlords returning to property they owned before ice buried them. Before humanity climbed out of trees and built civilizations on ground that was never really ours. And now they're home. I'm writing this as my final documentation before the transition completes, before whatever I'm becoming replaces what I was. If you're reading this, understand that the wilderness isn't empty and it isn't ours. There are things beneath the ice that are older than our species, that survived catastrophes that would have ended us completely. And that view humanity with the same detached interest we might show toward bacteria growing in a petri dish. The Arctic is warming, the ice is melting, and with every degree the temperature rises, more of them activate. More dormant forms wake up to find a world transformed and occupied by creatures they don't recognize as having legitimate claim to territory that was theirs first. We call it climate change. They call it reactivation conditions achieving optimal parameters. Either way, the transition is beginning, and there's nothing in our science, our weapons, or our understanding of reality that's going to stop what comes next. The survey is complete. The assessment is filed. The transition has been authorized, and I can feel it happening inside me right now. This very moment as I type these final words before I stop being the person who went to Station 7 and become something else, something permanent, something that will still be here long after humanity's temporary occupation ends. They're not invading, they're reclaiming. And we woke them up ourselves.